Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Another great episode lined up for you because last week I spoke about how those from within our military and the political officials, how they're actually destroying our military. That the lack of leadership and the systematic failures have damaged morale amongst all the service members. I explained how our military readiness is decreasing, and this comes at the worst possible time that you could imagine. As our power, influence, and military readiness continue to decline, Communist China is growing more ambitious, and you hear it in their rhetoric. This goes beyond the normal differences and power plays that we see throughout the international community. Communist China senses weakness. It's as simple as that. And perhaps they feel that this is the moment that they can directly challenge American power and authority on the world stage. It's something that should have everyone concerned. It's something I regularly warned about. All the signs were there, particularly if we look at the distribution of power throughout the world stage. Understanding how power is distributed in the international arena is critical to understanding how and why nation states behave the way they do. There is always a competition for power, and you're seeing this play out in real time. As a major superpower begins to decline, that's us, it creates more instability in the international arena as other nation states are going to jockey for position to acquire that power. It's a zero-sum game. And this leads to countries behaving more aggressively. China is the main aggressor. As this is occurring, the chances for conflict do increase. Then you factor in worldwide economic uncertainty, and it's like the perfect storm out there. Unfortunately, throughout the last few decades, our officials, both elected and appointed, have significantly weakened the United States. These policies put us on a path towards less self-reliance, less self-sufficiency, and the failed policies created an enormous dependency on a hostile power like Communist China. And it's such an important topic, it deserves a lot more than the 3.5-minute segments you're hearing in the mainstream media outlets. At a time when we really can't afford to get into a major conflict, things are heating up, and this issue merits much more attention than it's getting, especially considering that the defects of our dependency on Communist China were highlighted throughout the pandemic, yet not a damn thing was done to reduce this dependency. Instead, they continue to bow to their communist masters. For this episode, I'm going to talk about Communist China's increasingly hostile rhetoric, their hostile actions. I'll explain China's growth and how our officials aided and abetted the rise of China. I'll get into the sophistication of China's foreign policy, its ambitions, and why they're choosing now to flex their muscle on the world stage. Before I get into it all, be sure to click the follow button so you never miss an episode. Visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. And over the last week, the rhetoric coming out of Communist China goes well beyond the normal threats and provocations. This rhetoric represents a shift towards open hostility. And while the rhetoric has been increasing since the beginning of the Biden administration, they're basically trolling the Biden administration, it's gotten far worse over the last week. It went beyond rhetoric, actually. It's now open threats, especially given the Speaker of the House visiting Taiwan and the United States as a whole. When word leaked out that Speaker Pelosi may potentially visit Taiwan, this sent the communist authorities into a fury. They viewed it as a major violation of the one-child policy. That's existed since the Cold War. The one-child policy, it began to take hold under Jimmy Carter in the late 70s, and the parallels between the current administration and the Carter administration continue. Basically, at its core, our position is that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwanese Strait is part of China. The policy is murky. It's allowed us flexibility. It's allowed us to exercise our strategic ambiguity. And while we say that we agree with the one China policy, we also state that any resolution to the Taiwan issue, it must be a peaceful resolution. And while we say that, our actions tell a much different story because we've continued to have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. We have major economic interests. We have a good economic relationship with them. They produce most of the semiconductors around the world. We remain their most important security ally. If you look at the Taiwanese military, most of the equipment has made in the United States of America stamped on it. And while we say we have the one China policy, we also passed the Taiwan Relations Act. And this act serves as a security blanket for Taiwan. It states that the United States must help Taiwan defend itself. It's why we continue to do arms transfers to this tiny island. The Taiwan Relations Act has been in effect for, I think, something like 40 years. Getting back to the speaker, she is in Taiwan. She has landed. As far as this recording goes, nothing has happened militarily. Even though China has threatened some type of military action, we've seen a couple of cyber attacks against the Taiwanese president and some government institutions. We've seen a buildup of Chinese forces, but we haven't seen actual military conflict. The hostilities have increased dramatically, and I'll get to what China is saying in a minute. But first, whoever leaked out that the speaker was going to visit Taiwan in the first place should be fired immediately. That's just unacceptable. There wouldn't have been many people that would have been aware of this visit. Normally, these visits, they happen all the time. They happen, and like visiting any other type of controversial place, the top officials will fly in. You have the, President of the United States will go visit troops in a war zone. The visit takes place. They take pictures. Then, once the president's out of there, or once the top officials are out of there, we announce the visit happened, we release the video, and usually if another nation is upset with it, they'll register a diplomatic communique, a complaint, and everyone moves on quickly. Unfortunately, this was leaked ahead of time. The fact that this was leaked to the press weeks before her visit, her Asia visit, tells me that someone in the White House leaked this information to create a controversy and try and force the Speaker of the House to cancel her visit to Taiwan. And last week, you had President Biden and Xi Jinping. They have this emergency call over the Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. And according to reports, Xi told President Biden, quote, "Those who play with fire will perish by it, and that it is hoped that the United States will be clear-eyed about this," end quote. He warned Biden to adhere to the one-child policy. So what was our president's response to Xi's threats? According to the report, Biden stated that we strongly oppose unilateral efforts to change the status quo in the region and efforts to undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Yeah, that's going to show Xi. I mean, this is the supposed president of the United States. You just had the leader of communist China directly threaten us. And what was the president's response? Are you kidding me? Then you have the Chinese media, nothing more than a mouthpiece for the communist regime. They called for shooting down Speaker Pelosi's jet if she tries to go to Taiwan. A writer for the Chinese state-run Global Times tweeted, "If U.S. fighter jets escort Pelosi's plane into Taiwan, it is an invasion. The PLA has the right to forcibly dispel Pelosi's plane and the U.S. fighter jets, including firing warning shots and making tactical movement of obstruction. If ineffective, then shoot them down," end quote. So you have the Chinese leader threatening us. You have the state-run media where everything has to be approved by the communist authorities threatening to shoot down Speaker Pelosi's plane, basically calling for assassination. And this was our pathetic response. Amazing. Now, I'm sorry, but I may not like Queen Pelosi, and I may disagree with her on just about every single policy issue, but no foreign government or press outlet gets to threaten our speaker. Who the hell do they think they are? Not for nothing. I saw someone tweeted out, "What would you do if China shot down Pelosi's plane?" And the responses were disgusting. There were so many responses that said that they would thank the communist regime. That's disgraceful. Anyone putting that kind of response out there, even if it is a joke, it's not funny and should be ashamed of themselves. We can have our political differences. I don't have to like the politicians. I constantly criticize and berate our politicians every single week. But sorry, communist China or any other foreign government for that matter doesn't get to threaten and target Americans, especially the Speaker of the House. Those applauding stuff like that reminds me of those hoping Iran assassinates former President Trump and Trump officials. It is a disgrace. We need to be better than that. If the Chinese military assassinated Speaker Pelosi, that's an act of war, and the declaration of war would immediately need to be declared. And when you look at all these pathetic organizations that constantly bow to China, where are all these woke corporations, the social justice warriors out there? You know, the corporate giants that routinely criticize the United States, but they'll bow to the communists. Where's the NBA, the pathetic institution that it is? See, if the NBA or any of these companies had any cojones whatsoever, they would immediately boycott communist China until Xi and China walk back their hostile rhetoric. But they won't do that because they're friggin' cowards and they don't really care. While they preach and believe they are the moral holy warriors, they are pathetic public virtue signalers who bow to the almighty dollar. You know, they're constantly hosting fundraisers for Speaker Pelosi and the Democrat Party, yet have any of them come out to actually defend Speaker Pelosi. I mean, my goodness, I have to defend her. I am so mad at China for having to force me to defend Speaker Pelosi. You would think that the people that actually support her would be defending her, but they're all silent. Think about that for a second. And this is dangerous. So far, nothing's happened, but what if something does happen? We are in an extremely dangerous place, and it's partly due to our feckless leadership, partly due to our dependency on cheap Chinese goods, which many of the politicians from both sides of the aisle, the ruling elite, they're responsible for that. Throughout the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, everyone saw China growing at unprecedented levels, especially as it pertains to its economy and military power. The United States fueled this economic growth because we wanted cheap goods to import. And China, they also served a useful role in servicing some of our nearly $30 trillion debt. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, China held approximately $1 trillion of our debt. And when we look at the total of our debt, foreign governments hold a little over $7 trillion. So China has a 14% share. Interestingly, if you look at the last couple of years, China has begun to draw down its stake in our debt. And we should be wondering what their play is. Why are they doing that? But it goes beyond the debt. The coronavirus highlighted huge deficiencies we have in the United States. And the politicians, they were all bloviating that we're not manufacturing critical supplies here in the United States. We have this reliance on China. And what have they done since? What have they done since? They haven't done a thing to reduce our dependency on communist China. In fact, we're more dependent on communist China now, even as the regime is growing more bold and hostile. The communist authorities laid out their short and long-term strategic objectives decades ago. It's not like it was a secret. And they strictly adhered to Deng Xiaoping's rule, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. The question is whether or not the communist regime believes it's ready for a coming out party, that they bided their time long enough. And now they believe they are ready to flex their military might on the international stage. See, when you're examining this, China had 4 grand strategic objectives, and we see the roadmap. It's clear. Goal 1 is to maintain economic growth and stability so that it maintains authoritarian rule. Goal 2 is the comprehensive buildup of their military strength. Goal 3 is to weaken Taiwan's international standing and political will, ultimately leading to China recapturing Taiwan. And the final goal is to replace the United States as the world order. And they were well on their way to achieving the first goal. But now I'm not so sure about that. I think the heavy-handed response and Xi's demand for a zero-COVID strategy has certainly created some cracks and vulnerabilities in their economy and in their political system. If we were smart, we would be exploiting that. I'll talk about that more later, but just so you know, we're not, because we're not smart. It certainly appears that they have achieved goal 2. Communist China has made enormous investments in its military. They have rapidly modernized its military force. They have sophisticated technology. And while I do believe that we still maintain the tactical edge, at least on paper, there is no denying that the Chinese military is light years ahead of where it was just 20 years ago. As far as its third goal, it appears China is well on its way to making its move on Taiwan. I've been warning about this for the last 2 years. When you look at how aggressive Communist China has become, particularly in the South China Sea and by the Taiwan Straits, it doesn't take a military strategist to know that China has been poking and prodding Taiwan, especially when it comes to Taiwanese airspace and their defense capabilities. Understand that every time a Chinese fighter jet violates Taiwanese airspace, they are doing so as a test. They want to see how long it takes Taiwan to scramble their fighter jets. They're timing it. China is timing the responses. They're updating their military plans as they see fit. The same goes for the Navy and the seas. When it comes to the fourth goal, Communist China has been hard at work attempting to diminish our power and influence throughout the world, and they've done so successfully, particularly through their Belt and Road Initiative. Unlike our officials, Chinese officials are strategic thinkers. They're patient. And the Belt and Road Initiative highlights that. For those that are unaware of what the Belt and Road Initiative is or what it does, you have to realize they want to invest in other countries' critical infrastructure, especially countries that are struggling financially. That's who they look to exploit. If countries are broke, countries are starving for money, and they'll agree to any of the terms and conditions laid out by China. So communist China is going to loan these cash-strapped countries money on the promise of building out critical infrastructure and improving the economic situation in those countries. When you look at the terms of conditions of these initiatives, once the country is loaned the money, the country then has to hire Chinese firms as the general contractors to build out that infrastructure. Think about the genius of that. We're going to give you money, then you're going to give it back to us, and our companies are going to be the ones to build out this infrastructure. But you're still going to be on the hook for the loan. The Chinese firms will hire locals to do the menial labor, but Chinese companies, they're going to run and operate the critical infrastructure at the top levels. And when the country is unable to pay back the loan, guess who lays claim to the infrastructure? It's China. And we are talking about ports, airports, water supply systems, electrical grids. We are talking about everything. If a country doesn't have control over its infrastructure, can that country say it's a sovereign country? I mean, think about that. If that country goes against the policies of the communist regime, of the CCP, they know that China can cripple them by shutting down the electrical grid, causing problems with supply chain issues, slowing down air traffic at airports, slowing down the freighters and the shipping lanes. But that's not the only thing the Belt and Road Initiative has done. This initiative has also allowed Communist China to become the leader in rare earth minerals, something our electronics are wholly dependent on. Because of their investments throughout the world, they have cornered this market. Our politicians stood by and watched this happen for the last 30 to 35 years and did nothing to blunt the expansion of communist Chinese influence. In fact, some in the United States actually encouraged it because they were making money from it. They were getting rich off of it. Even when it became obvious what China was doing, our officials did nothing. A few minutes ago, I brought up how the coronavirus highlighted huge deficiencies in the United States that showed how our dependency on China for cheap products created a national security threat to us. Consider that at the height of the pandemic, we were finally having conversations about how we lacked the manufacturing capabilities to produce life-sustaining products, including PPE, including generic prescription medications, Tylenol, for God's sakes. We recognize that China is the one that has the monopoly in these. Imagine if we can't go to stores and get Tylenol because of conflict with China. And we recognize that China is obviously going to supply themselves and their people before they supplied us and the rest of the world. This is unacceptable and is easily preventable. But ask yourself, has anything really been done? Yeah, you could say the CHIPS Act. Wow, great. In 2, 3, 4 years, we'll finally make some semiconductors here in the United States. But guess what? Those facilities probably won't even be able to break ground because of all the EPA restrictions on building. Has Congress enacted any laws to make sure we have the capabilities to quickly produce life-sustaining products here in America, to make sure that we could take care of our own people in an emergency? And it's not just with healthcare. The same goes for rare earth minerals, too. We are seeing this big push for electric vehicles run on batteries that are produced by China. So not only is this policy hurting every single one of us when we go to fill up our gas tanks because the administration refuses to become energy independent and actually get gas out of the ground, oil and gas out of the ground, but they are now enriching the communist regime, increasing our dependency on this nefarious country because we're beholden to them for the batteries. It shows you where our officials' priorities are. They like to talk a good game. They like to deal with the pie in the sky, the theoretical. In reality, they're crushing us. Rather than recognizing the growing threat and making sure our military is on the top of its game, and even more important, making sure it continues to serve as the main deterrent against China's ambitions, what have we done? Well, we've essentially neutered our military. Our supplies are depleted, like I said last week. Our training programs have morphed from hardened drill sergeants who would break the soldiers before rebuilding them into well-trained killers, because that's what they are. That's what you want our service members to be, no matter how uncomfortable that may actually sound. Instead, now they're taking a holistic approach in basic training. We have to take the holistic approach. We don't want to hurt them. We got to coddle them. That's going to make for hardened soldiers. And this is all happening because our Pentagon has been taken over by a bunch of social science majors. Instead of understanding the changing nature of the battlefield in the 21st century, our soldiers are being bombarded with social justice slogans and proper pronoun usage. Rather than make sure our soldiers have the necessary gear, we have to make sure that our soldiers have maternity flight suits. As the threats continue to grow, we are witnessing an exodus out of the military. Those with the time in are choosing not to re-enlist. Why not? Why aren't they re-enlisting? Because they don't have the support. They don't have the support from the leadership. When you tell the soldiers that you think that they engage in a bunch of white rage and there's nothing but racists in the military, why is anyone going to re-enlist in that? We are discharging soldiers who don't get a vaccine that doesn't do anything to prevent the spread and transmission of the virus, as demonstrated by your most recent example in President Biden, who tested positive once again, and now his symptoms are coming back. What else are we seeing? Well, we're seeing all branches of the military missing their recruiting goals, and it's because of a lot of factors. You got obesity, mental health issues. You got those who don't want to get the shot because it's pointless. And now it's getting so bad that they're dropping standards to get into the military. So now it's not like you're getting the best of the best. Now you're going to drop standards. Those with criminal records, maybe drug abuse, past drug abuse history, mental health issues potentially. So what exactly are we doing here? Sooner or later, we are going to face a reckoning if we don't get this straightened out. And I'm not talking about that we could just sit there and wait till a new president comes in to get it straightened out. This is the most dangerous time to weaken our military like this. This is the time that we should be reinforcing our military, reinforcing ferociousness in our military, making sure our military is ready and able to handle all threats. Remind our adversaries and our enemies that no other country has a greater fighting force than we do. That's what we should be doing right now, but we're not. And that's why China may see this as their greatest opening. See, if they wait 2 years, if they wait till a new president comes in, they may not have this opportunity. A new president can turn the military around very quickly. From day one, this administration has proven that it is not prepared to take on China, including diplomatically, economically, from the intelligence community perspective, and maybe even militarily. China plays chess as we're playing checkers, and rather than pay attention to our main adversary, this administration believes that its political opponents here in the United States are a bigger threat to our national security than communist China is. Xi's regime doesn't fear or respect the Biden administration. That's clear. We saw that from the very first day. From the very first diplomatic interaction where you had top-level Chinese officials meeting with top-level U.S. officials, including the Secretary of State Tony Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, we saw that as the Chinese authorities went into a blistering attack on the United States. For several minutes, our Secretary of State National Security Advisor sat there and let China criticize the concept of a free society like the United States, saying that our country's a failure, democratic principles are a failure. They let China criticize our law enforcement, saying that our law enforcement officers are guilty of massacres. Chinese authorities criticized our failed foreign policy. The communist authorities used Black Lives Matter and criticized our record on human rights. And how did we respond to this verbal assault? Now, Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan could have easily brought up the systematic genocide against the Uyghurs and Christians that's currently going on in China in real time. We could have easily pushed back on China's horrible record on human rights. We could have easily criticized Chinese authoritarian state and the lack of liberty and freedom for the Chinese people. We could have easily pointed out the wholesale takeover of Hong Kong, where hundreds to thousands of people were imprisoned for expressing their want to be free. Journalists tortured for showing the brutality of Chinese authorities. We could have ripped China for the constant corporate espionage, stealing billions upon billions of United States dollars, billions of dollars in intellectual property. We could have highlighted how China routinely manipulates its currency to undermine trade practices worldwide. We could have easily demonstrated how communist China's lies led to a global pandemic. How if they would have been honest from the beginning, perhaps the coronavirus could have been contained to the Wuhan area. Instead, China locked down its own cities, but allowed people from Wuhan to travel internationally at will. We could have easily demanded that China release all the coronavirus strains it was working on at the Wuhan laboratory to prove whether or not it came from the Wuhan laboratory or not. But we didn't bring up any of that. Instead, here was the response by our pathetic Secretary of State and our pathetic National Security Advisor.
To tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described. I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking. And we'll have an opportunity to discuss those when we get down to work. And there's one more hallmark of our leadership here at home, and that's a constant quest to, as we say, form a more perfect union. And that quest, by definition, acknowledges our imperfections, acknowledges that we're not perfect. We make mistakes. We have reversals. We take steps back. But what we've done throughout our history is to confront those challenges openly, publicly, transparently, not trying to ignore them, not trying to pretend they don't exist, not trying to sweep them under a rug. And sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's ugly, but each and every time we've come out stronger, better, more united as a country.
A confident country is able to look hard at its own shortcomings and constantly seek to improve. And that is the secret sauce of America.
Then why were we wasting our time defending ourselves? We don't have to defend ourselves. Even worse, why were we validating Communist China's criticisms? They don't get to lecture us about human rights, just like they don't get to threaten our Speaker of the House. And listen, right now we're at a very vulnerable moment in our history. There is no disputing that. We don't really want to go to war with China right now. It won't work out well with the current military, the way the military leadership has changed our military. It's not going to work out well for us. But we also need to recognize that we're still the United States of America. And while Communist China has made significant gains over the last 40 years, they still have a lot of weaknesses that we can exploit. Unfortunately, our leaders are either too dumb to exploit these weaknesses or they're too corrupt. It has to be one or the other, because they're the ones that have allowed China's intelligence apparatus to infiltrate all aspects of our society, and they contributed to China's growth and power around the world. And here's the thing. We may be dependent on cheap Chinese products, but guess what? They're dependent on us buying their products, which puts us in a far stronger position than most people realize. It's going to be a lot easier for us to find a country that could produce cheap goods. China can't replace the American consumer. They could try and make trade agreements with a whole bunch of countries out there. It still wouldn't match up to what the American consumer spends on cheap Chinese products. China has to produce millions of jobs each year just to keep pace with its population. What happens if we stop buying their products? How long do you think that they're going to be creating new jobs? They're not. You know, when President George W. Bush was president, he was speaking to then Chinese leader, Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao asked President Bush what keeps him up at night. President Bush said another 9/11, and he never wanted to see another one. He didn't want to see another terrorist attack on U.S. soil. President Bush then asked Hu Jintao what keeps him up at night. And Jintao responded, creating 25 million new jobs per year just to keep pace with employment. See, the real threat to the communist regime is its own people. The communist leaders aren't dumb. They know that. Now that over 600 million Chinese people went from the ranks of poverty to the middle class over the course of the last 40 years, those people don't want to give up their lifestyles and rejoin the ranks of poverty. And if the Chinese economy collapses and unemployment skyrockets, what do you think is going to happen in the communist regime, to the communist regime, which is going to bear the sole brunt of the Chinese people's rage and desperation? So they're aware of that. And we have no idea what the real Chinese economy looks like and how it's suffering under Xi's zero-COVID strategy. What we do know is that those who have been locked down in the cities they're going mad. They're losing their minds. You cannot socially isolate human beings for long periods of time. You're going to start to see resentment and bitterness build up. And we have started to see the cracks form in the communist regime itself, in the Communist Party itself. As Xi attempts to become China's leader for life, there are many in the Communist Party at the highest levels questioning Xi's zero-COVID strategies and his thirst for power. While these criticisms are whispers right now, the political division within the Communist Party is not a new thing for China. They've seen it over the course of many decades. And many within the party believe that Xi wants the party to bow to him rather than him bow to the party. See, in a communist system, you better be careful. It's supposed to be about the party, not one man. Again, if our officials were smart, we would have intelligence assets trying to exploit the growing divide within the Communist Party itself. If there is friction internally, Communist China won't be able to focus on the external that's going on. We should quietly and immediately begin to reduce our dependency on Chinese goods. Most importantly, we should be projecting strength. Our president should have stated loudly and clearly that no Chinese authority gets to threaten our speaker, or any American for that matter. We need a president who projects strength. Unfortunately, this president can't do that. He constantly projects weakness. At the same time our president is projecting weakness, our military leaders are gutting our military by focusing on asinine issues that have nothing to do with making our soldiers better prepared for combat. The threats we face are growing daily, and I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know what happens tomorrow, the next day, the next week. What I do know is that the hostile rhetoric coming out of Communist China is much different than the rhetoric we used to hear. What I do know is that the Chinese military is becoming bolder and more ambitious, making tremendous advances over the last 2 decades. What I do know is that China sees the weakness right now in the United States, and they may believe that this is their best opportunity to usurp us as the global power. This is not a time to be sitting on our hands, and we all have to pay attention, because as the tension builds, this could become a powder keg where one spark can lead to a global transformation in the international arena. Now, I'm not defending Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. She hadn't had to go. She has to be there now because of all the controversy surrounding it. We would have looked even weaker if she pulled back on that. But it's not a time in history where we should be poking and prodding and antagonizing our adversaries, particularly one like China. At the same time, we have to remember that we are the United States, that we are the sole superpower as of right now, and I'd like to keep it that way. Our power and influence may be diminishing, but don't forget, it wasn't too long ago that we stopped the bleeding with our power and influence and started to increase our power and influence. It's amazing how quickly things can change in the international community and here in the United States. We're going to see where this goes. I'll pay attention to it. If anything major happens, obviously I'll release a bonus episode. I hope you found the content of this episode informative, and that's why I implore you to share it with others. Don't forget to give the P.A.S. Report podcast a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Take 30 seconds to write a review. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.